I helped an elderly man carry his groceries on an ordinary Tuesday evening, but the moment his daughter opened the door, saw me standing there, and dropped the plate in her hands, I knew nothing about my ordinary life would ever be ordinary again. He was 81. This elderly man, struggling alone with 4 heavy grocery bags outside the supermarket, while 100 people walked past him like he was invisible. I was the only one who stopped. I was nobody special, just a tired 28-year-old with an empty apartment and an emptier heart. A man who'd stopped believing that kindness ever came back around. But something in his trembling hands made me set down my own worries and carry those groceries the 6 blocks to his home. We talked the whole way. He laughed at my jokes. He told me I reminded him of someone. And when we finally reached his little blue house and he knocked on the door, he smiled at me strangely, like a man who already knew a secret I didn't. Then the door opened, and his daughter froze. The plate slipped from her fingers and shattered across the floor, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears as she stared at me like she'd seen a ghost. But here's what I couldn't understand. I had never met this elderly man before today. So why was his daughter looking at me like she'd been waiting her whole life for this exact moment? Why did the old man say my name to her before I ever told him what it was? And what did this stranger's daughter know about me that I didn't even know about myself? My name is Ethan Cole, and that Tuesday had started the way every Tuesday before it had started for the past 2 years, with the weight of nothing. Not sadness exactly, not anger, just nothing. The kind of empty that sits in your chest like cold coffee you forgot to drink. I woke up at 6:47 to an alarm I'd set but didn't need. In an apartment so quiet, I could hear the refrigerator hum from the bedroom. I made toast. I ate it standing over the sink, because the dining table still had 2 chairs pushed under it, and sitting at it alone felt like a punishment I hadn't earned. I put on my coat, went to work. A decent job managing inventory at a mid-size logistics company, did everything right, said all the right things to the right people, and at 5:15, I stopped at the supermarket on the way home, because I was out of milk and something resembling a reason to cook. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the parking lot, just past the automatic doors, and he looked like the world had forgotten he was still in it. White cotton cap pulled low over silver hair. A coat 1 size too big. 4 grocery bags cutting red lines into the thin, fragile skin of his fingers. He wasn't moving. He was just staring up the long street ahead of him, the way a man stares at a mountain he isn't sure he can still climb. A woman in heels walked around him. A young guy in earbuds walked straight past. A mother with a stroller never even looked up from her phone. And I stood there, watching all of this, holding my own basket. And something inside me, something that had been very quiet for a very long time, cracked open just a little. I set my basket down on the nearest bench. I walked over. "Sir," I said, "can I carry those for you?" He looked at me the way elderly people sometimes look at unexpected kindness, carefully, like they're checking if it's real, like they've been disappointed enough times to require a second look. Then something in his eyes softened and he smiled. Not a polite smile, a real one. The kind that takes over the whole face and doesn't apologize for it. "I was wondering," he said, in a voice like warm gravel, "how long it would take someone to stop." I took 3 of the 4 bags. He insisted on keeping one. We started walking. His name was Arthur Whitfield, and within 4 minutes, I understood that he was the kind of man who made the world feel like a better place just by existing in it. He asked about my job, and actually listened to the answer. He made a joke about the price of tomatoes that was so genuinely funny, I laughed out loud on a street I'd walked 100 times without ever smiling. He told me about his late wife, Edna, gone 3 years now, and he said her name the way people say the name of a song that still undoes them, quietly, carefully. Like the word itself was made of something breakable. "You live alone?" he asked somewhere around the 4th block. "Yeah," I said. "Just me." He nodded, slow and knowing. "That apartment gets loud, doesn't it? All that quiet." I looked at him sideways. "Yeah," I said, "it does." He smiled at the street ahead without turning to look at me, like I'd just confirmed something he'd already suspected. And then he said something I filed away without fully understanding. The kind of sentence you don't decode until later. when everything else has already happened. He said, "You know, there are some things in life that look like accidents but aren't. You think you're just carrying someone's groceries, but maybe something bigger is carrying you." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. And we walked the last 2 blocks in the kind of comfortable silence you only share with people you've somehow always known. His house was small and blue, tucked at the end of a street lined with maple trees turning copper in the October evening. A warm light glowed in the front window, and from somewhere deep inside that little house, I could smell something extraordinary: garlic and butter and something slow-cooked and deeply familiar. The smell of a kitchen that belonged to someone who cooked with love and time. It hit me somewhere behind my sternum and ached in a way I couldn't explain. Arthur knocked on his own front door, not because he had to. I could see the key sitting right there in his coat pocket. But he knocked, and then he turned to me with that same strange, knowing smile, the one that had been carrying its secret the entire 6 blocks, and said quietly, almost to himself, "I want you to meet my daughter." The door opened, and the world stopped. She was standing in the doorway holding a ceramic dinner plate, mid-step, mid-thought, mid-breath, and when her eyes landed on my face, something happened that I will spend years trying to describe accurately and never fully manage. Her whole body went still, not the stillness of surprise, something deeper than that. Something closer to recognition. The plate tilted in her hands, and then it fell, straight down, shattering across the front step in a crash that sent birds scattering from the maple tree behind me. But she didn't look at the plate. She didn't flinch. She didn't bend to pick up a single piece. She stood there with both hands now pressed to her mouth, and her eyes, these deep, dark, devastating eyes, filling slowly with tears, locked onto me as though she were seeing something she had once believed she would never see again. Something she had prayed for. Something she had quietly, privately, painfully given up on. The evening air sat between us, like held breath. And then Arthur, this 81-year-old man I had met 47 minutes ago in a supermarket parking lot, placed one gentle hand on his daughter's trembling arm and said 2 words in the softest voice I had ever heard come out of a human being. He said, "It's Ethan. Not this is Ethan. Not his name is Ethan. He said it's Ethan. The way you say it when you finally found something you lost so long ago that you'd begun to believe it was simply gone forever." My blood ran cold. I had never told this man my name. Not once. Not in the parking lot, not on the first block, not on the 6th. My name had never left my mouth. I looked at Arthur. I looked at his daughter, still frozen, still trembling. Tears now sliding freely down her face as she stared at me with those impossible, aching, overflowing eyes. And the question that rose in my chest was so enormous, so urgent, so deeply personal, that it nearly knocked the breath out of me. Who were these people? And why did it feel, standing on this broken-plated doorstep in the dying light of an October evening, beside a man I'd known less than an hour and a woman I'd never met, like I had somehow, against all logic, against all reason, against everything I thought I knew about my own ordinary life, just come home? Nobody moved for what felt like a full minute. The broken plate lay scattered across the doorstep in white ceramic pieces, catching the last amber light of that October evening, like something that had shattered ceremonially, like it was always meant to break, right here, right now, at this exact intersection of 2 lives that should never have crossed but somehow did. Maya still hadn't looked down at it. She was still looking at me, and I was still looking at her. This woman I had never met, whose tears were now tracking silently down the edges of her face, the way rain tracks down a window, quietly, inevitably, without apology. Arthur bent slowly, too slowly, the way 81-year-old knees negotiate with cold evening air, and began picking up the broken pieces one by one. That snapped her back. "Dad, stop!" Her voice broke on the second word. She stepped forward, gently took his arm, steadied him. "I've got it. Go inside." Her voice was soft but firm, the voice of someone who had spent years learning to take care of things before they broke further. She looked at him. He looked at her. Something passed between them. An entire conversation conducted in a single glance. And Arthur nodded once, slowly, like a man whose work was finally done. He patted her hand. He picked up his one grocery bag from beside my feet, and then he looked at me one last time with those steady, lighthouse eyes and said simply, "Come inside when you're ready, son." Son. I had not been called that in 18 months. The word hit me somewhere low and private, somewhere I hadn't let anyone near in a very long time. I swallowed hard and watched the old man disappear into the warm light of that little blue house. And then it was just Maya and me and the October wind and the maple trees and all those broken ceramic pieces scattered between us, like the punctuation of something unfinished. She crouched down and began collecting the pieces carefully in both hands. I crouched down too, because I didn't know what else to do, and we gathered the broken plate together in silence, piece by piece, close enough that I could smell whatever she'd been cooking. Garlic and rosemary and something slow and warm. And faintly, beneath that, something like lavender. From her hair, I think. When the last piece was collected, she stood. I stood. She held the broken pieces against her chest, the way you'd hold something you weren't ready to throw away yet. And finally, she looked directly at me and said the thing that changed everything. "Your mother's name was Margaret." It was not a question. The air left my body so fast I actually stepped backward. One full step. Like the sentence had physical weight, and I'd absorbed it in my chest. "How do you—" I couldn't finish. "Margaret Ann Cole," Maya said, and her voice was the steadiest it had been since the door opened, because she had clearly been carrying these words for a long time, and had finally found the person they were meant for. She used to say her full name like it was important, like names mattered. She'd say, "I am Margaret Ann Cole, and I was put on this earth to love well and leave things better than I found them." My throat closed completely, because that was exactly what my mother said, word for word. She'd said it my whole life. She'd said it the morning of the day she died. "You were her nurse," I whispered. Maya nodded. Her chin trembled once, but she held it steady. "Ward C, St. Emmanuel's Hospital. 18 months ago." She paused. "She was in room 14. Your father's photograph was on her nightstand. And yours." Another pause. Longer this time. "You with a gap between your front teeth that you've since fixed. Standing next to her at what looked like Thanksgiving. You couldn't have been more than 12. I remembered that photo. I remembered the exact day it was taken. My mother had made 3 pies, burned the first 2, laughed so hard about it she'd cried. Real crying and laughing tangled together the way they only get with the people who know you completely. I hadn't thought about that photograph in over a year, because thinking about it meant thinking about where it ended up, and thinking about where it ended up meant standing over everything I'd lost, and I'd decided, quietly, privately, that I wasn't strong enough for that yet. "She talked about you," Maya said. "Every shift, every night." I pressed my hand against my mouth. "She didn't talk about her illness. She didn't talk about being afraid. She talked about you, your laugh, the way you'd call her every Sunday without fail, the way you'd leave notes in her coat pockets for her to find later." Maya's eyes were bright and overflowing now. "She told me you used to tuck little folded notes into her pockets before she went anywhere without you, so she'd find them halfway through her day and know you were thinking of her. She said you started doing it when you were 7 years old, and you never stopped." I hadn't told a single living person that. Not one. It had been our thing. Private and small and completely ours. I'd slipped the last note into her hospital gown pocket the night before she passed. I don't even know what I wrote. Something simple. Something that said what I always said. "You're not alone. I'm right here." "She made me promise something," Maya said. And now her voice cracked fully open. Not dramatically, not performatively, but the way glass cracks under pressure that's been building too long. She pressed her lips together, regrouped. The last night I sat with her, she took my hand. She was so weak by then, but she held on like she still had something urgent to finish. And she looked at me, and she said, Maya stopped, drew one slow breath. She said, "If you ever find my Ethan lost in the world, hold on to him. Don't let him disappear into himself. He has the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known, but he doesn't believe it. He needs someone to remind him what he's worth. Something gave way inside me so completely and so suddenly that I couldn't have stopped it any more than you can stop a dam once the crack reaches the foundation. I pressed both hands over my face. I was not a man who cried easily. I had not cried at the funeral. I had not cried in the 18 months since. I had swallowed it all, and walked around full of it, and called that surviving. But standing on this doorstep, in the cooling October dark, with this woman holding broken ceramic pieces against her chest, and delivering my mother's last words to me, like a letter that had taken 18 months to arrive, I broke. Quietly and completely, the way real grief breaks, without drama, without warning, without a single moment of preparation. Maya didn't say anything. She didn't try to fix it or rush past it. She just stood there and let me break, the way only someone who truly understands grief knows how to do. Like she knew it needed to happen. Like she'd been standing here holding this for me and waiting, for 18 months, for me to finally be ready to receive it. After a while. I don't know how long, she said softly. She loved you so much, Ethan. So much. The whole ward could feel it. I wiped my face, looked up. The sky had gone deep blue, and the maple trees were black silhouettes against it, and the light from Arthur's window fell warm and gold across the porch, like a hand extended in welcome. Your father, I said. My voice was rough, unsteady. Arthur, he was there? He knew her? Maya nodded slowly. Edna, my mom, she was in room 16, 2 doors down. Margaret and my mother used to talk through the wall. A small, tearful, heartbroken, beautiful smile crossed her face. They became friends in their final weeks. The way people do when time is short and pretending doesn't make sense anymore. She looked down at the broken pieces in her hands. Dad sat with your mother once, when you couldn't be there. She showed him your photo. She made him promise the same thing she made me promise. The full scale of it was settling over me now like something enormous and quiet, like snow. Arthur had not stumbled upon me today. He had been waiting. Without knowing exactly when or how, he had been watching, the way people who make sacred promises to the dying watch. Quietly, faithfully, ready. And the moment he saw my face outside that supermarket, the face of the boy in the photograph, the son of Margaret Ann Cole, he had picked up his grocery bags and waited to see what kind of man I had become. He had needed to know if I was worth the promise he'd kept. Come inside, Maya said gently, and there was something in her voice now, something careful and tentative and almost afraid, that told me she wasn't just offering warmth and soup and shelter from the October cold. She was offering something far larger, something she'd clearly thought about, something she'd told herself she wouldn't hope for. But hope, I was learning, does not consult us before it arrives. I looked at this woman, this stranger, who knew the sound of my mother's voice in the dark, who had held her hand when I couldn't, who had carried a promise across 18 months, without knowing if she'd ever have the chance to deliver it, and I felt something move in my chest that had not moved in a very long time. Not nothing, not cold coffee, not the refrigerator hum of an empty apartment. Something alive, something that had been waiting, just like Arthur, just like Maya, for me to be ready. I stepped forward, across the broken pieces, into the warm light of the doorway, into the smell of rosemary and garlic and something slow-cooked and full of love, into the beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet. But just before I crossed the threshold, I stopped, because I had just remembered something. Something that had been sitting at the very back of my mind since the moment Maya said her first word to me, and had only now worked its way to the front with a cold and certain clarity that made the hair on my arms rise beneath my coat. 18 months ago, the night my mother died, I was not in room 14 when it happened. I had stepped out, just for 20 minutes, to get coffee, to breathe, to survive another hour in that antiseptic-smelling corridor where time moved differently and hope got smaller by the day. And when I came back, she was gone. I had never forgiven myself for those 20 minutes. I had rebuilt my entire inner life around that absence, that gap, that 20 minutes where I was not there when she needed me most. It had been the silent engine of all my emptiness, all my cold coffee mornings, all my refrigerator hum evenings. But Margaret Ann Cole had not been alone. Someone had been there. I turned slowly and looked at Maya. Really looked at her. At the careful steadiness in her face. At the way she was watching me with something that looked almost like bracing, like she had been carrying something else, something heavier, something she hadn't said yet. "Maya," I said. My voice barely made a sound. "Were you with her when it happened?" Her eyes filled again immediately. And the answer, before she even opened her mouth, was already written across every line of her face. But what she said next was not what I expected. It was something so much larger, so much more devastating, so much more sacred, that I had to reach out and hold the doorframe to keep myself standing. I found the note. 3 words, spoken barely above a whisper, but they detonated inside me with the quiet, total force of something that rearranges everything. The way an earthquake doesn't announce itself. It simply shifts the ground beneath you and leaves you standing in a world that is the same in every visible way and completely different in every way that matters. I stared at her. "The note in her pocket," Maya said, and her voice was the kind of steady that costs everything to maintain. The folded piece of paper. She pressed her free hand flat against her own chest, just below her collarbone, the gesture of someone describing where something lives inside them, rather than where they put it. "I found it when we were—" She stopped, started again. "I was with her, Ethan. I was holding her hand. I had been there for the whole hour before, talking to her, reading to her. And right at the end, when everything got very quiet and very still, I remembered you'd mentioned the pocket. She'd told me about the notes, and I thought—" Her jaw tightened against the emotion pushing through it. "I reached into her pocket and I found it, and I unfolded it, and I read it to her. She looked at me with eyes so full of tears they had stopped falling, and simply sat there, brimming, suspended, out loud, so she could hear it. I couldn't speak, I couldn't move. I was made entirely of the sound of her voice, and the weight of what she was telling me. It said," Maya's voice cracked once, recovered, pressed forward, with the determination of someone delivering something that was never meant to be kept. It said, "You're not alone. I'm right here." She exhaled, long and shaking and relieved, the breath of someone who has carried something heavy for a very long time, and has finally set it down. She smiled. "Ethan, when I read it, she was so weak, and she was so tired, and she had been so ready to go, but she smiled. A real one. Like the message reached her exactly where she needed it to." Maya wiped her face with the back of her wrist. "She was not alone. I promise you. She was not alone for a single second of it. Something cracked open in me so wide and so deep that I felt it in my hands, in my knees, in the backs of my eyes. I had spent 18 months building a prison out of 20 minutes. 20 minutes of coffee and corridor and the particular cowardice of needing to breathe. And I had sentenced myself to live inside that guilt, like it was permanent, like it was just, like it was what I deserved, for stepping away when she needed me most. I had carried it every morning over the sink with cold toast, and every evening in the empty chair, and every single night in the refrigerator hum of a quiet apartment that used to feel like mine, and had slowly become just a place where I waited, without knowing what I was waiting for. And here, on a broken-plated doorstep in October, a woman I had known for 11 minutes was handing me back the 20 minutes I had lost, gift-wrapped in something I could not have bought, or earned, or found on my own. Proof. The one piece of evidence I hadn't known I needed. My mother heard my last words to her. She heard them in the voice of a stranger, who loved her enough to deliver them. She heard them, and she smiled. And she went. She went not alone, but held. Not in silence, but with my words. I sat down on the front step, right there among the last remaining fragments of broken ceramic. I just sat down, because my legs had made a quiet executive decision about what they could and could not support anymore. And I pressed my face into both hands, and I let 18 months of it go. Not in the loud, performed way people cry in movies, but in the real way, the ugly and private and total way. The way that doesn't care what it looks like, because it's not for anyone but you. Maya sat down beside me. Not in front of me. Not across from me. Beside me. Close enough that her shoulder was against mine. warm and solid in the October cold. She didn't say anything. She didn't rub my back or whisper consolations or try to move things along. She simply sat there and let me feel everything I had been refusing to feel for a year and a half. The way she had sat with my mother, present, patient, steady as a lighthouse, while everything around it churns. I don't know how long we sat there. Long enough for the maple trees to go from silhouettes to shadows. Long enough for the light in Arthur's window to shift as he moved quietly around his kitchen, giving us the sacred, knowing privacy of a man who understands that some moments require witnesses and some require only time. Long enough for the October cold to settle its full weight around us, and for neither of us to move away from the warmth of the other. When I finally looked up, the street was dark and still, and the stars had come out over the rooftops one by one. And Maya was sitting right there beside me, knees pulled up, broken plate pieces still cradled in her hands, looking up at the same sky with an expression that was the most complicated kind of peaceful, the kind that lives on the other side of sorrow, the kind you only learn to wear after you've worked for it. "Thank you," I said. My voice was wrecked and quiet and meant every syllable. She turned and looked at me. Up close, and in the low gold light from the window, her face was the kind of face that takes a while to understand. Not because it's complicated, but because it's entirely genuine. And genuine faces are rarer than we admit, and we forget how to read them when we've been living too long among careful, guarded ones. "She would have found a way to get to you," Maya said. "Even without my dad, even without the parking lot. She wasn't the kind of woman who left things unfinished." Something that was almost a laugh moved through my chest and came out soft and broken and grateful. "No," I said. "She really wasn't." "Neither am I," Maya said. And then she looked slightly alarmed at herself, like the sentence had arrived before she'd fully approved it, and she looked back at the sky quickly, with the ghost of embarrassment crossing her face. But I had heard it, and I was glad. We went inside. Arthur was at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea already poured and a third waiting, like he'd known the exact temperature at which this evening would find its way to his table. He looked up when we came in, looked at my face, looked at Maya's, and something in his expression settled the way water settles when the wind finally stops. "Complete. Arrived. Sit," he said, with the quiet authority of a man who has been waiting a long time to say a simple word, and enjoys that the simplest word is finally the right one. We sat, and we talked. For 3 hours around that small kitchen table, we talked the way people talk when they've been given permission to finally be known. Openly, messily, gratefully. Arthur told stories about Edna that made all 3 of us laugh, and then quietly ache. I told stories about my mother. Maya listened with her chin in her hand, and her eyes doing that thing, that particular, extraordinary thing, where they were completely, dangerously present, not waiting for her turn to speak, not assembling her response, just there, just receiving. Somewhere around 9:30, she got up to check on the food she'd completely forgotten about, and I followed her into the kitchen and stood in the doorway, watching her move between the counter and the stove with the easy grace of someone in their native element, and I thought about all the ways a life can pivot on a single small decision. The decision to set down your basket, the decision to cross a parking lot, the decision to keep a promise to a dying woman you'd known for 6 weeks but would carry the rest of your life. "It's still good," she said, lifting the lid and checking. The kitchen filled with steam and rosemary and that slow, deep garlic warmth. She turned around and found me watching her, and she didn't look away, and I didn't either. "Maya," I said. "Yeah, I'm going to come back tomorrow, if that's all right." She was quiet for a moment. In the good way, the way that means the answer is being felt rather than simply found. "Dad has a doctor's appointment at 10, she said, "but he's home by noon." A pause. "I'm home all day." I nodded. "Then I'll come at noon." She turned back to the stove, but not before the smallest, quietest, most carefully contained smile moved across her face. The kind people make when something they'd stopped hoping for has just walked through a door they'd forgotten to lock. I went back to the table. Arthur was sitting with both hands wrapped around his mug, looking at nothing in particular, smiling at everything in general. The television was off. The house was full of warmth and food smells, and the particular silence of a home where grief has been lived in honestly and has slowly, stubbornly given way to something else. I thought about my apartment, the 2 chairs, the hum of the refrigerator, the cold toast over the sink. I thought about what my mother had said to Maya. He has the biggest heart, but he doesn't believe it. He needs someone to remind him what he's worth. I thought about Arthur in that parking lot, standing in the cold with 4 grocery bags cutting into his old hands, watching 100 people walk past and waiting, just waiting, to see what kind of man I had become. I thought about the note. You're not alone. I'm right here. And for the first time in 18 months, sitting at a stranger's kitchen table that felt less like a stranger's with every passing minute, with the smell of a home-cooked meal finding every cold corner of me and warming it slowly back to life, I felt the truth of those words not as something I had written for someone else, but as something being written for me, right now. By all of it. By the parking lot and the 6 blocks and the broken plate and the kept promises and the note in the pocket and the woman in the kitchen who smiled at Haish, full of the kind of light that has no business being that beautiful this late in the year. But there it was anyway. Uninvited, unearned, freely given, exactly like the best things always are.